Welcome to the 1CA podcast. I'm your host, Jack Gaines. 1CA is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, or field agents to discuss their experiences working the last 3 feet of foreign policy. The goal is to inspire you and anyone interested in working on ground with partner nations and their people. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or guest hosting, contact us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have that email address in the show notes. And to find out more about the Civil Affairs Association, check out our website at www.civalaffairsassoc.org. I'll also have that website in the show notes. Now enjoy the show.
They really are, I would say, legendary now. I mean, the ISIS fighters that fight against them are scared of them. And they're not that there's anything wrong, but they're not in support positions. These are units, fully combat capable units with all female fighters. They're as heroic and effective as their male counterparts.
Today, we welcome Michael Patrick Mulroy, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Mick worked for Secretary Mattis, Esper, and the transition to the new administration. He is also a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer and a United States Marine. He is coming on the show today to discuss the integration between field operations, civil affairs, and diplomacy. Mick is currently running the Lobo Institute and is a national security analyst for ABC News and an advocate to end child soldiering. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. So, without any further ado, let's go on with the show. We've got sound. You can hear me. I can hear you. Let's record.
No problem. And I don't know if you saw, Jack, the paper I sent you that might be also, I sent it a little late. I should have sent it earlier, but it's me and retired Lieutenant General Ken Tovo. We were on the original Lyle team together, which is the team that went into Northern Iraq before the war. But the whole paper is about DOD working closely with the CIA and how we need to make sure that this isn't just a one-off thing for the GWAT that just goes away. And the officers of the future need to be like the interagency compatible. Like we need to really recognize we're one team, and essentially the rivalries that existed pre 9/11 need to come back. So and of course, irregular warfare, which, I played a small part with the strategy that came out, but really pushing that irregular warfare isn't just CT, right? It's near peer competitors. It's every spectrum of warfare, and it needs to be considered that it's going to be a different version. Maybe influence is going to be a lot more important in certain aspects, like near peer competitors, than direct action type stuff. But anyway, that's what that paper is. If you want to post it when you put this, or
absolutely will. And that's one thing that I'm sure you've seen is you come up with all these brilliant moments where you find cohesion between agencies, or you find that special operational moment where things really worked, and then it gets forgotten.
It's forgotten, right? And then especially when you don't have that, necessity of war, when it goes away, at least in some large part, right? Then everybody goes back to their corners and starts doing their own thing,
right?
And then they're surprised we don't work well together when we run into the next conflicts, right?
Right.
So with me and General Tobo and another guy, Uncle Andy, who's a pretty legendary paramilitary officer, can only use that part of his name. So it was 3 writers. So if you want to ask about that, happy to talk about that.
Well, one other place where we probably crossed paths or we complemented each other was your work with child soldiers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was at AFRICOM, and I was the PAO that closed out OC, or Operation Observant Compass.
Yeah.
I was going to say that's a fantastic story about using military assets plus agency assets to influence a population to shift away from, a bad cycle, basically.
Yeah, I think that you're 100% right. Hopefully it will get more talk, because we did a documentary on one of the child soldiers from that really
My Star in the Sky.
Yeah.
I'll put a link to that on the show notes as well, because I think that's worth checking out.
Yeah, he's an awesome guy, but now an author from Montana is writing the book.
Oh, great.
About the documentary, about the guy.
Right.
And his book sold 4 million copies. So this is going to go from a story that, very few people, except for the people that worked in it, know about, to hopefully A lot of people know about it. So
Right.
it's going to get a lot more talk, I think, for good reasons. I mean, how we effectively work together with Ugandans. And then just the story of this individual and his wife, who was also a child soldier.
Right.
It's just inspirational, man. It's like one of those stories that you can't, it's hard to believe, but it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fantastic. So anyway, let's start talking through the subjects. We'll
Yeah,
spend
no
all
problem.
day. Well, as you know, I brought you on because I wanted to talk about how there needs to be a more concerted effort between DoD development and diplomatic field operations in partnering
Yes.
on the ground on that last 3 feet of foreign policy. And,
Yeah.
this is a civil affairs podcast, but we're interested in how everything comes together, because whether you are a CA person or a public diplomacy person or a field ops person, what do you need to do to call them? How do you get them involved? What are the right words and things to do to get them interested?
Yeah.
You have that paper that you wrote, and I'll add that to show notes. But if you want to talk about it a little bit, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I would like to talk about that. So I'm an analyst for ABC News,
Mm-hmm.
and they asked me to do an article on covert action in the CIA, right?
Oh,
But
okay.
it's at the strategic level. Like a lot of people, and in a way they're right. It's like covert action gets done in a vacuum.
Sure.
A lot of the people that are responsible for executing the national security strategy have no idea what the agency's doing. Every other agency, from state to DoD to Treasury to Commerce to, just go down the list there. It's supposed to be a cohesive effort with one department assigned lead, others in support. The agency does play, I think, a significant role. But what I was advocating for in the paper is that it's more incorporated into, at least for those that can have knowledge of generally what the agency's doing to meet the objectives in the national security strategy.
Right.
Right. So that's what I advocated for, and more consistent funding for covert action. So it's not necessarily just a spike based on current world events.
Right.
Since our adversaries have pretty consistently been China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and then CT. None of those are going to go away. It should be resourced at a level that's very consistent so that you can continuously do the needful. And then, of course, if there's some spike in conflict, that it could be supplemented. But I think integrating into our national security strategy a bit better, so it's not just the president and like the director of the CIA that knows about these things, and then funding it so it doesn't have the troughs that really take a long time to come out of when it comes to, hiring new people and getting more infrastructure. And that should be very consistent, just like the military is.
Sure.
They have the resources ready for a big event like a conflict between nations.
Right. And one of the challenges I've seen, because I work public affairs, but I do it at the TS level a lot of times, is trying to figure out how to keep people who are not touching covert or clandestine integrated with people who are covert and clandestine. And so what I've tried to do is build guidance and recommendations for an intermediary, usually the operations manager, to where they know what clandestine people, officers are operating with, networks that they're influencing, operations that they're managing. And they also are knowing what's the public side, what is the public outreach, the diplomacy, the engagements that's happening. And then they integrate them so that one doesn't step on the other. And also they complement each other so that as a clandestine operation goes on, it creates maneuver space for those public operators to be able to do their job and succeed, and vice versa. Sometimes you need public facing operations to go first in order to build the content for a clandestine to be successful as well. And so by trying to describe that relationship, to me, it tries to build a more comfortable process. And also one where an intermediary can then go and describe to leadership why, the clandestine is important and why that public position is important and how they interact with each other. Because I think without it, most people see clandestine operations as a one-off, when it's not. It's part of weaving a larger narrative in operations and in achieving strategic goals.
No, you're exactly right. Sorry if you can hear the dog drinking water, but I have a mountain wall that basically drinks like she just crossed the desert. I mean, she drinks for like 6 minutes. But if you could hear that, sorry about that. But no, you're exactly right, Jack. Well, clandestine, of course, is trying to hide who is doing the operation because it depends on what authorities you fall under. Title 10, Title 50. Title 50 is a covert, right?
Right.
And in covert is the ability basically to deny it. Like, I don't know what happened. That car just blew up. And I'm not talking about a specific thing, but it gives the agency the authority to be deniable, right?
Sure.
I think they work better when an operation is both clandestine and covert, right? So you're not trying to deny the obvious, right? Where it's like, sure, you didn't do it, right? So, but they do, to your point, they need to be integrated into our overall mission. It's the U.S. national security objectives. It's not one particular department or agency. It's really important that they do work together. That's why I was advocating for a strategy that actually has a covert action annex, just like we had an irregular warfare annex. And of course, it would be limited to who needs to know it, but it would be a little broader. And it doesn't have to say how, right? Nobody in my old job should be talking about how we do things, right? Sources, methods. It doesn't have to do that, but it does have to say this part of our national objectives, that's ours, and we're responsible for it. And if we need assistance, which we do often with the military, then they'll be the supporting effort, right? And oftentimes it'll switch who's in the lead. If there is a problem in a country, and this is like our hypothetical, or we could use North Iraq, where there's going to be an insertion of clandestine covert forces first, before we have made the determination to go to war. That gives us the ability to say, they're not go to war. Obviously, in the case of the Iraq War, we decided, but there was teams that were inserted. And that gave the country the ability, the president and all of his cabinet, the ability to determine, one, gather information, intel, to determine whether this was necessary. Two, to build up the forces that would assist us. And in the case where I was, it would have been the Kurds. And then to essentially evolve it into from a Title 50 to a Title 10, right? Because we're not going to invade a country that size with just Title 50 forces. We're going to need the Army and the Marine Corps. So that's a good example, whether you agreed with the war or not, but we're talking operationally here,
right?
Of how you could transition from a Title 50 based endeavor to a Title 10 that fit like this, and one significantly helps the other, right? Sure. Basically, the people doing very similar things, but doing it in a way that's more clandestine and is deniable to give our policymakers, and some people forget this sometimes the country we're working with doesn't want to talk about the U.S. involvement, that they're getting assistance for the United States, but it's still a common objective, and we want to help, but we don't want to hurt them in the process.
I remember Jordan early on was very cautious about U.S. involvement within the country, but as Syria started to implode, they were more open about having that U.S. presence because they knew their populace would feel more secure, knowing that military forces were worth their forces on the border. So how do you see standard outreach and clandestine operations on the ground helping forward foreign policy?
Sure. And, as you know, I can't go into too many details about what I did, but, what's approved is I was what's called the paramilitary operations officer for, 20 years in the agency, which is kind of like the SOCOM component of the agency. It's called Special Activities Center. But I was a case officer and a paramilitary officer because we're like a hybrid of two things, just to give you the background. And so I certainly did see from a chief of station, from a chief of base, from a chief of a team, if you will, like an expeditionary team, just being the line paramilitary officer. Right. So I saw it from there. And then my last job, I had the privilege of being Secretary Mattis's and Secretary Esper's deputy for the Middle East. Right. So very much in the policy, I'm not political, but I'm very much that job is very much makes policy for the U.S. when it comes to DoD with the interagency, et cetera. So I got to see how one line case officer collecting information can then get analyzed by analysts at the DIA or CIA, and then end up directly influencing the policies of the United States.
Sure.
Every meeting when I was at the White House, which is like 3 times a week, we'd have these policy coordination meetings, and it would lead with an intelligence brief every time. So we were on a common set of facts. It was the DNI, or sometimes the CIA directly, laying out the facts. And then the discussion took those facts, and then, obviously there was positions by, State Department, Defense Department. The IC stays out of the policy part. They simply, they're there to present the facts and analyze the situation. So I always knew that my intels that I was writing were going into the agency. They do give you feedback on whether it was read by who, and you do, even, at my level and up, you get executive intelligence. Well, my old job, that is, not now, not here in Montana, but in the Pentagon, we would have intel briefs every day, right? Every day. First thing, come in, 7:30 in the morning, in my case, DIA briefer, who's briefing all sorts of intelligence from across the intelligence community. And that informed me on the stance that I thought DOD should take. And then, of course, when we went to have a meeting, we had a briefing. So to your question, it does directly, and it should directly influence the policy discussions and eventual decision, because it's what the United States has deemed the most reliable information on what is actually going on. It's not perfect, it's not infallible, but it's a lot better than just one individual's personal assumption.
And speaking about that level of intelligence, I've always been a big fan of Sue Gordon, who used to be. I've reached out to her a few times, and whenever she's been on a show or been published, and I always say, hey, that was a great, talk you did. And she's very encouraging too. She's like, just keep going, Jack, with your, integration between public affairs and intelligence. And so good people.
She is really good people. And when I was at Pentagon, she was the deputy DNI. So I was in a lot of meetings with her, and in true IC fashion, she was, just the facts. That is what we should be, we being, the IC. We're there to provide objective analysis, not to be influenced by, political realities or preferences or any of that stuff. And I think that's really done well across the IC, but Sue was a really good example.
What I appreciated about her was her drive to shift the IC out of counterterrorism and into competition and foreign malign influence. I felt like she was very timely on that, ringing that bell, which I believe has helped the IC to start seeing the bigger picture on foreign influence. So
yes, and that was one of the areas that I think we kind of collectively dropped the ball on, and also one of the things we focus on in the irregular warfare annex. In CT, if something blows up Times Square last night, you'd be asking me about CT, right? So I'm not poo-poo. I mean, we got to keep our eye on that, but we can do a lot more than just one thing, right? We spend almost $1 trillion on our defense a year. We can do multiple things. Obviously, look at the war in Ukraine right now. Most people didn't expect that, but now we're in for a multi-year long, significant war on the footsteps of NATO. It doesn't emphasize your point and Sue's point. I don't know what does. So now we're looking at Iran, who I think this year could easily get to a nuclear weapon, and that could create a conflict. Obviously, some country, namely Israel, has already said,
that might just knee jerk and strike them. Yeah, I've never.
Yeah, I mean, they've already said existential threat, and they're not going to wait around to find out if they use it. So unless you're taking their word for it, I mean, they're at 60% enrichment, and from my understanding, it only takes a matter of weeks to get to 90%, and they have enough to make 4 weapons. It's the last I read. It's not, they don't have access to, classified stuff. But that's another conflict that might be coming. And then, of course, you always have the China issue with Taiwan, North Korea,
not getting enough attention, so they launch a missile.
And they announced yesterday that they're going to exponentially increase their nuclear weapons capacity and ensure that it has the ability to hit like Los Angeles. And then they're accusing us of causing it. Well, there's going to be an arms race because now Japan and obviously South Korea are seeing this and they have to defend themselves. And the United States has to react too, of course, when you have somebody essentially viewed as unstable that now has a nuclear arsenal and may have the ability to deliver it fairly soon.
Yeah. Well, do you have any thoughts on strategic pacing? Like, let's take a country, Thailand or Cambodia, where they are feeling the pressure of China on their doorstep. But they're also feeling the pressure of Australia, Japan, the U.S., to stay either neutral or, we would love for them to switch and be purely U.S. support or ASEAN supportive, but it's a difficult position for them to have. We do have civil affairs, public diplomacy, field operators on ground in those countries working with the local populations. Any advice to them on how you see strategic competition happening? Do you think it should be more construction and development focused, or like local leader, community leader engagement focused? Or should we just focus on national leader level engagements to keep forwarding that national policy?
So the short answer is all the above, and I'll get to those individual. The first thing that I noticed when we talked about strategic pacing, lots of times people focus geographically. When it came to the deployment of forces, like, oh, well, we just have a new strategy and China's at top, so let's just send everybody to be off the coast of China. It's like, that's not necessarily, I'm not saying that we're not going to shift some forces. That's the purview of the chairman, but it is more than just geographically. Like, you can compete, you want to compete against Russia and China and all the countries you just mentioned. Right. So first, they may be more important than who we send to Beijing or Moscow, right? Which are very locked down and very difficult. Not that we shouldn't have presence there, but it might not be the most effective presence when it comes to, one, collecting the information that we need to develop policy. That could be done in another country and often is. So it's important for that reason. The other part I'd say is the continuity of being a partner is very important for the United States to be able to outcompete China, Russia, and other countries that we're interested in outcompeting.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is countries need to know that, and this is difficult in a democracy where you have changes of administrations, but they know we're going to be consistent. Like our national security strategies, the saying used to be, it ends at the border. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be now. That makes the work of diplomats, that makes the work of intelligence officers and defense attachés difficult. So I would hope, so I'm speaking broadly, that whichever party is in power realizes that in order for the United States to be more effective over time, we need to be consistent. So they should think long and hard before just going through and just removing everything their predecessor did. And I hear this all the time from friends I know that are in other countries. And then also when I talk on foreign media, and that's one of the questions they always ask is, the United States just seems to be like a fair weather partner. I wouldn't agree with that, but to the extent that our partners start viewing it that way, we need to take umbrage and realize that we need to be as consistent as possible. So they know that when we're there, we're doing a good job, they feel like they're supported, they feel like they'd rather fall in with the United States over China, that we keep whatever we're doing to make that work, which could be obviously key leader engagements at the senior level, but also that just basic level of the political officer or the liaison working with CT, that they see the value for them in working with the United States and that it's really a partnership, right?
Right.
Whereas some other countries, and I'd say namely China, it's about something China wants.
Yes, more of a client relationship.
Yeah, they need natural resources. You have them, we want them, let's do business. Maybe simplifying it, but I don't think that's the way the United States does business. I think we need to double down on that. I also think, the United States is the leader of the free world and we shouldn't shy away from it. We should support human rights all over the world. And our involvement with countries helps them get better. You hear a lot of questions about like, well, why does the United States deal with this country? Their human rights record isn't so good. I don't disagree in many of the cases about how these countries do with human rights, but us being involved, us being present, and us pushing a partner to do better is better than us just washing our hands and saying we're not going to play, because then they're just going to have the influence of autocratic states like China and Russia, who don't give a damn about other people's human rights. They don't give a damn about their own citizens' human rights. So they're going to have zero influence. So, I do get the criticism, but I think the solution is where, I would deviate. And I know this isn't your question, but deviate a bit and say the US being involved in countries whose human rights are potentially not up to ours makes them better over time, I think. Vice just throwing up our hands and saying, well, we don't want to participate with you because you guys don't have the same standards.
It's always an odd balance because I've seen it both ways. I've seen countries, representatives, they've talked to me about it and said, okay, the United States comes in and they always have strings attached to their diplomacy and their development money to where, what do they say? We have to perform in a way that makes the U.S. happy versus other forms of development where they're, left alone to work through their issues. And then on the opposite side are those who complain that we just slap sanctions on countries and ignore them if we don't like what they do. So it is a difficult balance to get that involvement where we're participating, as well as trying to bring a country to a place where they are a good international partner.
Mm-hmm. And it is a balance. Quiet diplomacy sometimes works better.
Sure.
Right. If it's a constant, getting on TV and berating a partner for something, that's not necessarily that effective. Maybe not having as strict as contingents on aid as we have in the past, maybe, because that's not what China does. They don't care what the country's doing to their own citizens. So we have to maybe do more quiet diplomacy where we talk about how we can progress in areas like women's rights or the rights of minorities, and rather than look for, a microphone to get on there and berate them. It's definitely a balance, and there's no right or wrong answer we have to deal with because the people that we're competing with don't have the same standards we do.
Sure.
1 million people incarcerated because of their religious belief.
Yeah, Uyghurs, that's an amazing and horrible story.
Yeah.
What do you think about women's peace and security? DoD is starting to get budget for it, and they're trying to figure out how to use it. We haven't fulfilled our budget in total, in past years. Civil Affairs has started to get some leadership in that role. Do you have any thoughts on women's peace and security?
Well, I'm for it. So you tell my mom, wife, and daughters and goddaughters, I'm definitely for women's peace and security. In all seriousness, it's probably the most important thing in the diplomatic sphere, in the human rights arena, that we can do.
Sure.
Right. They're generally 50% of the population. And in many of the countries that are the most war-torn, they have no influence in government. If you had more women involved in government, a lot more women, I think you would have less conflict. It's just, I spent my entire career in conflicts.
What about military? Do you think that we should be training women for military positions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they should have completely equal opportunity in the military, right? They should be, and it is in the United States, in my opinion, but we could do better. But we're talking countries that women can't even look at. Afghanistan now. So one of the things that Lobo Institute, we advise the State Department on Afghanistan. And I know that a lot of the media has moved on, but it is god awful over there. It's worse than it was, I think, even when we went in the first place. Women they can't walk down the street without a male relative. They've thrown them out of elementary school, right? So as one female Afghan told me during one of our meetings, they are okay with them begging on the streets, but they can't go to elementary school. And we negotiated that. I mean, that's a whole new topic, but we have a lot to account for when it comes to the plight of women and girls.
Well, and the reason it struck me is thinking about the ISIS and Kurdish fighters. I believe that part of the reason the ISIS have become more respectful towards women is that the Kurds had female fighters and female leaders. And it took conflict for them to overcome that prejudice.
Right.
I'm not advocating for the U.S. to start shipping weapons and training to women in Afghanistan, but if we had trained women in the military and they actually served in military positions, it might have softened the Taliban position against women.
And when we left, there's more women in the university in Kabul than men.
Right.
So, and now there's zero.
Yeah.
So that's a stat. And to your point, if people are interested in reading about the female fighters, Gail Lamone, a friend of mine, wrote a book about them. And it's incredible. They really are, I would say, legendary now. I mean, the ISIS fighters that fight against them are scared of them. And they're not that there's anything wrong, but they're not in support positions. These are units, fully combat capable units with all female fighters. They're as heroic and effective as their male counterparts.
So this is the end of part 1. In part 2, Mick Mulroy talks about China and competition. So stay tuned to the 1CA podcast, and thank you for listening.